Today's video lesson is on proving triangles congruent using tests for congruent triangles. We'll take a look at triangle congruence tests using only 3 parts for triangle congruence. Rather than having to prove with all 6 angles and all 6 sides, we can prove with just 3 parts. Then we'll also eventually look at 2-column proofs and proving triangles congruent by one of the congruence tests. First, we'll just take a look at the actual triangles and see why it's only necessary to have 3 parts congruent. We've already looked at and learned that congruent shapes are exactly the same size and shape, and corresponding angles and corresponding sides of triangles are congruent. Our third angle theorem says if 2 angles of one triangle are congruent to 2 angles of another triangle, then the third angles are also congruent. So this would say if A is congruent to angle D, and if B is congruent to angle F, then angle C has to automatically be congruent to angle E. Third angles are congruent. We have 4 different tests for congruent triangles. The first one is the side-side-side congruence test. We abbreviated SSS for side, side, side. It says if 3 sides of one triangle are congruent to 3 sides of another triangle, then the triangles are congruent. You have to look at the markings on the drawings and know how to mark the drawings to show why 2 triangles are congruent by each of the different tests for congruence. Here we can see that the sides are marked congruent. Just having 3 sides congruent will automatically make the triangles congruent. The second test is side-angle-side congruence test. Our abbreviation is SAS, where the angle is in between the 2 sides. So if 2 angles and an included angle in between the 2 sides of one triangle are congruent to 2 sides and an included angle of another triangle, then the triangles are congruent. Again, here we see the markings on the sides of the triangle, and then the angle has to be the angle in between the 2 sides that are marked on both triangles to be congruent by side, angle, side. Our next test is angle, side, angle. This one, the side is in between the 2 angles. It has to be the side in between the 2 angles in order for this test to work. If 2 angles then and an included side of one triangle are congruent to 2 angles and an included side of another, the triangles are congruent. We can see we have the 2 angles marked, and the side happens to be the one that makes up the 2 angles. That would be angle, side, angle. The difference of that one and the next one is where the side is located. Our fourth one is angle, angle, side. This one has 2 angles and a non-included side. If 2 angles then and a non-included side of one triangle are congruent to 2 angles and a non-included side of another, the triangles are congruent. This one I always think of as the side is opposite one of the angles, so we can see that from the picture. You're allowed to mark on a drawing without having to prove or show it 3 basic things: a common side, which we're going to label eventually as or call reflexive property, something is equal to or congruent to itself. A common angle, same thing, we'll label this as reflexive property, which you should know from algebra. It's a smaller version of our transitive property that we've already learned. We are allowed to mark vertical angles congruent, and if we're given sides parallel in a picture, we're allowed to mark angle pairs congruent. So that would be the ones that we just studied: alternate interior angles corresponding, alternate exterior angles, and so on. According to the markings on the drawing on this example, how are the triangles congruent? So here's an example of triangles where you only have 2 parts marked congruent. So instead of looking at it as they're not congruent, we'll take a look at, we have on this one vertical angles. So we're allowed to mark again a common side, common angle, or vertical angles. If we see the arrows somewhere on the picture, then we can use the types of angle pairs like alternate interior corresponding alternate exterior angles. On this one, since we marked these 2 vertical angles congruent, this one would be angle, side, angle. This one has the side in between the 2 angles, So we will label it as angle, side, angle. That's how the triangles are congruent. This is our test of congruence. Our second one, we have these two sides are marked, and then we have a pair of angles marked. We have a common side between the two triangles, so we'll mark the common side. You'll have a lot of common sides between two triangles if they share something. In this case, XL is what they share in common. So on this one, our triangle congruence test will be side, angle, side. You list according to what you have marked on the picture as to how the triangles are going to be congruent. Our final test for congruent is called the hypotenuse leg test. As it says, this is right triangles only, not any other kinds of triangles. There's two examples shown of what it would look like for the hypotenuse leg test. Both of them you have to have the hypotenuse marked congruent and then one set of legs congruent. So here's an example of hypotenuse leg, and then here's the second example of the hypotenuse leg theorem. Those are the tests for congruence, and that's it for our lesson for today.